Get ready to dive into the captivating world of Toronto's founding days with Adam Bunch, a historian who has dedicated his life to uncovering the city's fascinating past. Today, we're focusing on a particularly juicy chapter, the relationship between John Graves Simcoe, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, and his wife Elizabeth. From their unconventional courtship to the challenges of establishing a British colony in the wilderness, Adam will paint a vivid picture of this power couple and the surprising scandals that surrounded them. Get ready for a story filled with love, adventure, and a touch of pyromania right here in the heart of what would become Toronto. And sorry if you heard my son, he wanted to participate too. This is Muddy York. And great, we're here. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
No, thanks so much for having me.
So, as you guys heard in the intro, we're talking about John Graves Simcoe. So, Adam, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about your background and how you know so much about the man, and a little bit about what you are doing right now?
Yeah, so I do Toronto history basically all day, every day. Got pulled down a rabbit hole many years ago, and it's sort of taken over my life ever since. So I've written a couple of books about Toronto history, the Toronto Book of the Dead and the Toronto Book of Love. Simcoe's definitely a big part of both of those books, and especially some of the more scandalous stories in the Toronto Book of Love. I teach a Toronto history course at George Brown, do public courses online all the time, walking tours, lectures, host of a Canadian history documentary series on YouTube called Canadiana. Yeah, lots of stuff on the go all the time. And yeah, I think the Simcoes, both John Graves Simcoe and his wife Elizabeth, their whole family is absolutely fascinating. And yeah, even though they came here, was it like 230 years ago now? I think they had a huge impact on the city by being there in its founding days, and in a lot of ways, we're wrestling with their legacy even now. So yeah, they're one of the families in all Toronto history I'm most fascinated by.
So, we know something about falling down a rabbit hole of Toronto history, but instead of looking at John Graves Simcoe, the man, we're going to be talking about one specific part of his life, or you will, which is his relationship with his wife and, all of the complications that came with that. And I believe he first met her during the American Revolution. So, can you introduce us to that setting?
Yeah, actually, the American Revolution is when it seems like he probably fell in love for the first time, uh, but not with his wife, Elizabeth, with another young woman who he met in what was, just about to become the United States. So Simcoe is a hardcore supporter of the British Empire, this British military officer. He's following in his father's footsteps. His dad had fought in the Canadian colonies against the French a couple of decades earlier in that big 7 years war that sort of climaxes in the Canadian colonies in New France with the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. His dad was there sailing a ship as a captain in the St. Lawrence, died here in the St. Lawrence in Canada just a couple of months before the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And as a young man, Simcoe gets sent to fight against the Americans in the American Revolution. And that's where he really makes his name as a young man. He's still in his 20s fighting this war, becomes something of a hero on the British side, a villain for the Americans. And it's while he's there, this sort of dashing young officer, that he seems to have fallen in love, maybe for the first time in his life, with an American teenager named Sally Sarah Townsend. So Simcoe is in the area around New York City, which is controlled by the British at the time. He's spending a lot of his time doing patrols through the area around the city. And he's living on Long Island, billeted with an American family, Townsend. We're sort of forced to take him in and let him stay with them. And it's there that he falls in love with their teenage daughter, Sally. So he's spending all this time at their house, spending all this time with Sally, who I think is 18 at the time. He's 27, something like that. And
Just to remind everybody, A relationship with an 18-year-old in the 1770s didn't mean the same thing that it does now.
No,
Oh,
not
yeah.
quite as icky, although like eyebrow raising, I think, even in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So not everybody probably would have been comfortable with it even back then. But certainly, Simcoe seems to be really into her, and she seems to be really into him too. All the other soldiers, the British soldiers, are getting jealous of all the attention that Sally Townsend seems to be paying to Simcoe. They are flirting all the time while he's living at this house. He's showing a lot of interest. And it gets to the point where when February rolls around and he's still living at this Townsend house, he actually sends her a Valentine, which is thought to be the very first Valentine in North American history, which is a bit of poetry of a questionable quality, which Simcoe is very fond of producing big poems. Most of them are about the glory of the British Empire. But this one is sort of an ode to Sally Townsend, but also sort of a lament about his own life and how it's defined by war. And he finishes the poem by wondering whether it will ever not be that way, whether he'll ever get to experience peace, and with sort of the god of love answering that he should take his answer from Sally's eyes. And he attaches a little sketch to it too. Two hearts have united by Cupid's arrow. Each heart has one of their initials on it. And he asks her to be his Valentine, but he is set up to have his heart broken by Sally. He has definitely fallen in love with the wrong girl.
Okay, do tell.
And why is that?
What a gripping story. I'm hooked.
It's because we think Sally was probably a revolutionary spy.
Twist.
Her brother was one of three men who were put in charge of this spy ring called the Culper Ring, which was set up by George Washington himself during the Revolution. It's was such a big deal that it's been called the spy ring that saved America. And since her brother, I think Robert, was helping to run this spy ring, historians think that it's incredibly likely that Sally was an informant for the spy ring herself. And that the reason she was spending all this time with Simcoe, flirting with him, paying him all that attention isn't because she had any interest in Simcoe at all. In fact, she had plenty of reason to hate him. He was on the other side of the war from her family, who were revolutionaries. He'd even chopped down the family's beloved apple orchard in their backyard to use the wood to reinforce a nearby fort, and that she was only hanging out with him in order to try to overhear his conversations. There's one attack, even, that some historians think might have been foiled by information she got by overhearing Simcoe's conversations with another British officer, an officer whose ghost is said to haunt that house where they were living to this day. It's still there. It's in a little town on Long Island called Oyster Bay, the Raynham Hall Museum. They even have a pane of glass, which might be an artifact of this flirtation, of this kind of love affair. There's been inscribed, scratched into the glass, are the words, "To the adorable Miss Sally Sarah Townsend." People think it's likely Simcoe who scratched those words into that glass before getting pretty soundly rejected by Sally Townsend, who, of course, did not become his Valentine. Absolutely was not interested in that way. He would get his answer from her eyes. He would spend the rest of his life on and off fighting wars, end up dying during the wars with Napoleon, and sort of just later that year would end up forcibly removed from the Townsend's home when his unit was attacked in an ambush. He was captured, sent to a revolutionary prison, spent the next 6 months in sort of dank conditions. His health never really recovered. And he was eventually sent home to England as part of a prisoner exchange, with a pretty healthy distrust of Americans and American style democracy, in part because he'd been fighting this really brutal war against them, in part because he was just a diehard believer in the British system. I like to think maybe a little bit in part too, because he'd had his heart broken by Sally Townsend, the revolutionary spy.
So you mentioned that he returned to England after fighting in the Revolution. So what happened with his personal life there?
Yeah, so that's where he finally meets his wife. In fact, there's a chance they already knew each other. John Graves Simcoe and Elizabeth Gwilym had actually been born coincidentally in little villages in Northamptonshire, just very close to each other. But the first time we know for sure that they meet is when he returns to England. He's still nursing his wounds. He's been fighting in this losing war. He's literally been wounded in battle. He's been wounded maybe by this broken heart as well. So he decides to head to his godfather's house, who's got a big country estate, Hembury Fort House, the gorgeous rolling green hills of Devon, literally an official area of outstanding natural beauty there, a spectacular place, sort of a landscape with stories about fairies and pixies and smugglers and ancient sunken lanes and ancient Iron Age hill fort on top of the hill that this house stands on, where he goes to stay with his godfather, who was his dad's best friend. He was also captaining a ship in the St. Lawrence back during the 7 Years' War. And as he returns to his godfather's house, his godfather's niece is also staying with him. She's Elizabeth Gwilym. She's sort of grown up from little bits and pieces of the family taking her in now and then because her middle name is Posthuma. And that's basically because she was a posthumous child. Her dad died in the 7 Years' War before she was born. Her mom died in childbirth. So she's been an orphan essentially her whole life. She loves her godfather, stays with him. And at this point, toward the end of the American Revolution, meets her uncle's godson, John Graves Simcoe.
Can we just take a moment to observe that naming your child Posthuma is just a very morbid thing to do?
They are, yeah, they're a very good fit for morbid Toronto history. But his middle name, because it's his godfather's last name, Samuel Graves, is this guy
Right.
who's his godfather and her uncle, which is, itself a little morbid sounding. And then her middle name is Posthuma, which is incredibly morbid as well. And they kind of spend their whole lives surrounded by death and tragedy. But they've got some love stories too.
Okay. Now,
And so
yeah, you have to tell me a little bit about that too. Geez. Yeah.
they meet, as far as we know, in this period at Samuel Graves' country estate, and quickly seem to start falling for each other. So they go for long walks through this gorgeous countryside, down these ancient sunken lanes, visiting that Iron Age hill fort, coming home at the end of these long walks. He's a lot taller than Elizabeth. She's a pretty short woman. So they say she had to run every few steps to catch up with them as they made these walks. Did sketches of the countryside and then would take them back to the house and turn them into paintings. Elizabeth was a wonderful artist herself and fell pretty deeply for each other. Uh, Her aunt, Samuel Graves' wife, was a little suspicious of the match, wasn't a fan of the relationship, but Samuel Graves himself really encouraged it. And before long, they had fallen really seemingly deeply and truly in love and headed down the hill to an old stone church, sort of nestled in the valleys where they got married and would end up spending the rest of their lives together. And coming to found Toronto together as well.
Well, as you mentioned, Simcoe eventually got a very high sounding job that was unfortunately located in the middle of nowhere, just a bunch of wilderness where no proper gentleman would ever think of living out in the sticks. One might as well have been in Timbuktu. Why don't you tell us about what happened there?
Yeah, so in the wake of the American Revolution, there are tons of people in the new United States who are still loyal to the British, who didn't support the revolution, were perfectly happy with the way things were before. And after the revolution, after the British lose and the United States becomes an independent country, you have tens of thousands of people who feel this way and who are no longer welcome in their old homes, in these old colonies that are now states, where they're seen as traitors for being loyal to the British. They become refugees thanks to that war. Lots of them forcibly driven out of their homes. There are stories of people's houses being burned down, of families being attacked while they're out on picnics. Lots of them leave the US and head to England, but tens of thousands of them also come north to the Canadian colonies, the ones that have stayed loyal to the British. And there's so many of them that the British decide to create a new colony for them. They're going to take old New France, which they've renamed Quebec, and slice it in two. And the already very populated part, which is filled with Francophone Catholics, that becomes what we now think of as Quebec. But there's this other half, which isn't settled by settlers, mostly still home to the indigenous people who've been living here for thousands and thousands of years. What's now southern Ontario, that becomes Upper Canada, which is specifically going to be a home for these loyalist refugees. And John Graves Simcoe is the guy they put in charge of it. Since he has this experience in North America, his real hatred of Americans, a real love for the British system, so they know he's deeply loyal. And he also has this military experience, which they think is going to be very important because the Americans might invade at any moment. So they send him off across the ocean to what to the British is the very edge of the known world, the shores of Lake Ontario, where he's tasked with setting up this new colony on this indigenous land. And when he comes over, he brings most of his family with him. So Elizabeth boards the ship with them. They bring their two youngest children. They leave the older ones behind to keep going to school and head out here to live first at Niagara for a while. And then they decide to found a new capital for the colony, since Niagara on the lake, what was Newark back then, is just across the river from the big American guns at Fort Niagara. They sail across the lake to start a new colony at a place where there's a nice protected, sheltered bay that's now Toronto Harbor, and pick this as the place that they're going to build this capital. And Simcoe's pretty clear about what his vision is for this colony and for the capital in particular. We're incredibly lucky. He actually wrote a letter before he left England to come here, laying out his plans for the city that would eventually become Toronto, the capital of his new colony, which he thought maybe he would call Georgina, which he called York for a while, but which we call Toronto, the old indigenous name for this place. And when he arrived, he had his wife and some of his family and even a couple of pets, a white cat with gray spots and a big Newfoundland dog named Jack Sharp, and sort of tries to have a successful upper class British family life living here on the shores of Lake Ontario, which again to them is the very frontier. And that's where I think the most fascinating part of Elizabeth Simcoe's life in particular ends up taking place.
Okay, so now we just have to get there, and that'd be great. Yeah.
So Elizabeth's with him and plays a really important role in the founding of the colony. So Simcoe's spending his time setting things up, getting stuff built. They start by building Fort York because, again, they think the Americans might invade at any moment. So the first thing they want is to have a military presence here, chopping down the ancient old trees in these forests that have been sort of maintained by local First Nations for countless generations, uh, carving roads out of the wilderness, Yonge Street, Dundas, so that he'll be able to move his army very quickly through the colony, meeting with local First Nations, sort of making alliances. And while he's doing all of that, sort of setting up the government, preparing for war, Elizabeth has an incredibly important social function. That she's meant to import that kind of upper class British drawing room culture The stuff we know from Jane Austen novels and Bridgerton, that's very much this era. They arrive here in 1793. In fact, Elizabeth has a gift from the Queen, who's the Queen from Bridgerton, Queen Charlotte, that she's brought all the way here, this big spinning wheel. It must have been incredibly hard to get here. Their voyage across the ocean, that takes like 2 months. They arrive in Quebec City. They're stuck there for a whole winter waiting for the St. Lawrence River to thaw. When it does, they canoe their way up the river. They have to do all these portages every time they get to a big rapid, climbing out of their canoes, hauling this spinning wheel the whole way, sailing it finally across Lake Ontario. When they're living here, they're living in basically a big fancy tent that they call the canvas house. They used to belong to James Cook, the famous explorer of the Pacific, who lived in it during those explorations. Now they live in it here. It's got fancy wallpaper and like wooden floors that fold out, and is sort of adorned with this spinning wheel they brought all the way here, even though Elizabeth never uses it ever. It's just that it's a gift from the Queen, so it's an important sort of status symbol that she brings all the way here, because that's kind of her job here, is making this place a fancy British Jane Austen-y kind of scene. And she keeps a detailed diary. So we have this incredible record, sort of a day by day breakdown of the city's founding days. She's painting watercolors so we can see what the harbor looked like the week the city was founded. And she writes about all these dinners and dances and balls and card parties that she's hosting right there, sort of on the waterfront in this tent, in the forests and on the lakeshore, sort of trying to recreate that kind of Jane Austen-y, Bridgerton-y scene out here in this tent surrounded by the forest and the lake, where she's doing everything she can to make it a very British place, but also at the same time, sort of getting to enjoy freedoms that an upper class woman back home in England never would have been able to enjoy. So her diary is also filled with these sort of adventurous details. She's taking canoe rides up the Don River. She's exploring the forests alone on her horse. Her favorite place, maybe in the world, she calls them her favorite sands, or what's now the Toronto Islands. Back then, it was still a sandbar connected to the mainland, where she would be even sort of more free. But she's not only thousands of kilometers away from sort of the heart of British culture and imperial power in England, she's also even able to explore these forests by herself, to head out to the islands, to the sandbar, where she's even on the other side of the bay from all the eyes of the soldiers and other early settlers who would be living there and starting to move in. And she does some pretty bizarrely adventurous things too. So I think my favorite, maybe single fact about Elizabeth Simcoe is that when she comes to the Canadian colonies on this trip to found Toronto, she becomes something of a pyromania. While they're in Quebec City during that winter, they're sort of snowed in. She sees the effect of forest fire. And she loves the way that the smoke hangs in the trees. And all through her diary, she's obsessed with sort of fire related stuff, from the like static in her dresses to rumors of a volcano somewhere outside Quebec City. She's very fascinated when a house fire breaks out in Quebec while they're there. And for the rest of her time in Canada, which is the next like 5 years or so, she starts setting her own fires just because she enjoys watching them burn. So she's sort of trying to recreate the effect she saw in Quebec with that forest fire, setting fires in long grass and watching the flames race along the ground. One of them she sets out there on the Toronto Islands, sort of as her own entertainment, sort of, yeah, becoming something of a firebug the whole way through her diary. It's bizarre to read. The first time I read it, I wasn't sure whether this is just something people did back then, but no, it absolutely wasn't. is the kind of thing that if she'd been doing back home in England would have likely
True.
really had a dramatic effect on her reputation.
Wow.
And while she's here, she's playing with some metaphorical fire as well, spending an awful lot of time alone with her husband's right hand man, this guy, Thomas Talbot. Something that, again, would have been unthinkable back home in England. To spend time alone with an unmarried man would have been incredibly scandalous. But out here, she's got some freedoms she wouldn't have had back home, as I say. So her diary is also filled with all these little, really romantic sounding moments that she shares not with her husband, with only like one or two exceptions. All the most romantic moments in her diaries shares with Thomas Talbot, this dashing young officer, when she's upset by the sight of some passenger pigeons in a cage at a market flapping and squawking away. It's Thomas Talbot who pays to have them released so she won't be upset. It's Thomas Talbot who's bringing her back gifts when he meets with local First Nations leaders, along with John Graves Simcoe. When Toronto Bay's frozen over and they take a walk out over to the sandbar, to the islands, it's Thomas Talbot who takes her by the arm as they walk across the ice so that she doesn't slip. They have They're teasing each other as they sort of look ungainly in canoes that they're not familiar with. At one point, there's a scene in her diary where she and Thomas Talbot out on the island having what sounds like a scene out of a romance novel, racing their horses across the sand, thundering hooves, them alone out there on the other side of the bay. Something, yeah, back home would have been unbelievably scandalous. That is something she seems to be quite enjoying doing here at Toronto.
It
And
sounds like it could be like a Netflix series, like Liz and Tom or Simcoe and Talbot or something like that.
well, yeah, there actually is one TV show they made about Simcoe, but not from this part of the life. They were interested in that spy ring. So there's a show called Turn from years ago that AMC made. It was on Netflix
Oh,
for a
I do
while.
remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, where they've turned Simcoe into sort of a psychopathic villain. He's the antagonist of the show, dealing with that exact spy ring. But yeah, to me, the most fascinating part of his whole life is here founding Toronto and what his wife sort of is getting up to at the same time.
Hmm.
And in the end, she is a loyal wife. She heads home to England with her husband at the end of their years here. They're only in the Canadian colonies for something like 5 years before they head back home to England. They spend the rest of their lives living on a country estate sort of next door to where they met, which is a patch of land they're able to buy with her inheritance. It's again, a gorgeous place. John Graves Simcoe, he doesn't live very long. He had gotten his answers from Sally's eyes about whether he'd be fighting wars for the rest of his life, and he absolutely was. He ended up dying during, as I mentioned earlier, the wars with Napoleon. He didn't even die in battle. He actually got sick. He had bad asthma. He got sick on board a ship that he was taking to go to the war in Portugal because this ship had been freshly painted with toxic paint. So it gave him horrible asthma. When he arrived in Portugal, they thought he was too sick to fight. So they just sent him back home to England on the exact same ship he had just arrived on. So by the time he got back home to Devon, he was deathly ill, only had a few days left to live. So he died in the early 1800s, still sort of in middle age. Elizabeth lived a long life into her 80s. So she lives for decades after John dies, but is always loyal to his memory, never remarries, never has another big adventure like her travels through Canada again. So becomes more conservative even as she gets older. And in the end is laid to rest right there on their property, on the country estate. They built a little chapel there they call Wolford Chapel. They're both laid to rest beneath it. Some of their children are there too. You can still go visit it today. It's still on their old land in the countryside of the West Country in England. And is now, actually, if you go visit this chapel, you'll find a Canadian flag flying outside, an Ontario heritage plaque on the property, because the chapel was actually given to Ontario, I think back in the 1960s. So it's actually officially Canadian soil that they rest in to this day, side by side, for eternity. Thomas Talbot, though, who she's been spending all this time alone with, he stays in the Canadian colonies. He becomes incredibly powerful out in the western part of southern Ontario. So, sort of the shores of Lake Erie, around London. There's Talbot, I think, road that runs through London. There's Port Talbot. There's a Colonel Talbot Road, too, because he's put in charge of sort of settling part of the colony, handing out this indigenous land to the settlers there. But even though he's this incredibly powerful, wealthy figure, he sort of keeps to himself for the rest of his life. He lives basically the life of a hermit. He's got a big cabin up on a bluff looking out over Lake Erie, the beautiful view. And despite all this, sort of seems to be living a lonely life. Decades later, he gets a visit by a famous British author and feminist, Anna Jameson, who stays with him for a few days. And she's heard stories about what a cranky old misogynist he is. But she finds him to be the opposite. He's very warm, he's very social. She really enjoys her time with him and really wonders why he has this reputation and why he lives this hermit like life. So she asks around for what people think, why they think he's like this. And the story people tell decades after the Simcoes go home is that Thomas Talbot, as a young man, had his heart broken by the woman he loved and that he's never recovered from it. And he lives as a hermit because he's never recovered from this heartbreak of his youth. And we'll never know one way or the other, of course. But historians have kind of wondered, I think, ever since, whether that woman was Elizabeth Simcoe and whether those romantic moments they shared at Toronto back in the late 1700s were moments where he really was truly falling in love with her.
So what we heard here was a story of, we'll say, mild scandal, proprietary
A love
scandal,
story.
upper class Bridgerton scandal. But Toronto has some other far more scandalous stories. Where would people learn about some of those more scandalous events?
Yeah, scandals are one of my favorite things to talk about, not just because they're usually pretty juicy stories, but I think they've also got a lot to teach us about the city and how it works. Uh, Even from those founding days, Elizabeth wasn't the only one raising eyebrows back then. Simcoe wrote about how moral he wanted this new town, this new capital to be, but there are all sorts of stories of duels and scandalous affairs and heartbreak from that era, and then all through the rest of the city too. Big corruption scandals and everything. So I've decided to put together a whole course filled with these stories. It's going to be 4 weekly lectures starting on September 16th, but they'll all be recorded, all happening over Zoom, and the recordings posted to a private page on YouTube. So even if you missed the first class or so, you can still catch up. And then a similar note, actually, with Simcoe and falling in love with that spy, I'm also going to be doing some spy content over the rest of the year, too. I'm going to give a talk at this year's Word on the Street about spies and traitors and thieves, and I think do a course about that later in the year as well. So if people want to check out, yeah, more scandalous stories, more spy stories, I've got tons that I'm going to be sharing in the months to come. You can find links to all that, all my work and registration for the course and everything on my website, which is just very simply adambunch.com.
And we'll make sure to also share those links with you guys as well. Adam, do you have anything else to add? My Adam, not this Adam.
I just like to thank Adam Bunch, henceforth referred to as Other Adam, for appearing on the Muddy York podcast.
Honestly,
Thanks so much for having me.
yeah, what a great storyteller. We'd have to continue having conversations about different topics. It was thoroughly enjoying listening to you speak, and I'd love to hear more. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. Guys, make sure that you like the podcast, leave a review, like and share, tell your friend, tell your mom, tell your aunt, tell your cousin, tell everybody, because we love hearing about Toronto history and sharing that with you guys. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time.